It's Wednesday, February 28th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts with Dr. Devin Caughey, professor of political science here at MIT. He earned his BA in history from Yale University and an MPhil in historical studies from Clare College, Cambridge, where he studied under the eminent Southern scholar Tony Badger. Returning stateside, he graduated with an MA and PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Caughey works primarily in the area of American politics, political methodology, and Southern politics. He is the author of 3 books, including The Unsolid South, Mass Politics, and National Representation in a One-Party Enclave, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2018 and won the American Political Science Association's Leon Epstein Award for Best Book on Political Organizations and Parties. Dr. Caughey, Devin, thank you so much for having us here in Cambridge, which I assume on most days is more beautiful outside than it is today.
Yeah.
But the real fun, the real action's in here right now. So let's start at the beginning. Tell me about growing up in California.
Well, as you know, I moved to California when I was 2, but yeah, lived there through my childhood and just outside of San Francisco, and so I was about as far as possible from the South itself, although, as I'm sure you know, Southern influences extended all over the country, and
right.
Southern immigrants came to California and settled much of it. So maybe I got it secondhand there, but that's not where my interest in Southern politics really originated.
Well, were you one of those people growing up that you on election nights you watched returns or things like that? Were you a political junkie from an early?
No, I was no. I read that. I was like nerdy kid who read the newspaper and Time. I read Time.
Oh yeah,
pretty cool. And
my mom would have said that was a little right of the road. We were a Newsweek.
Oh,
household.
Newsweek. Well, I think we got both. So I think I read both, and but anyway, no, I was sort of interested in the world and everything like that, but I wouldn't grow up in a particularly political family, and I would not say I was a political junkie. So I don't have like clear memories of staying up late to see whether Clinton beat Dole or Dukakis.
You didn't have to stay up very late.
No, that's true. I was a bad
one.
example. Let's say Dukakis. I don't know. Yeah.
Right. Well, tell me, you've eventually majored in history at Yale. So what led you to this desire to take a history major for your undergrad?
Well, I always loved history. I loved to read about it, and it really wasn't particularly interested in American history to begin with. I would read when I was in high school, I'd read European history or whatever, and then I got to Yale, and I tried out a bunch of things, but I always knew that history was the sort of stuff that I liked the best. And I took a bunch of ancient Greek history, so I had a little bit of that. But then I migrated over, probably because I spoke Spanish. I learned Spanish growing up in school. I migrated over into Latin American history. So I wrote a thesis about Latin American history and missionaries in Latin America.
Right.
So that's how I got into history, but I will say that so I was a history major, and I didn't really take hardly any political science classes, except in my senior year, I took a class with David Mayhew, who is one of the most eminent scholars of American politics, and someone who's very interested in historical perspectives on American politics. Anyway, and so he actually had a selective seminar that a friend of mine sort of said I might like taking, and so you had to sort of like write little things saying why you should be let into the seminar. And I said, I don't know, I just said I was a historian and interested in political science, and I think that's why he let me in, because he's like, yeah, I like historians. So,
right.
But anyway, taking that class got me really interested in, it was my first taste of studying American politics from a political science perspective, but it was also my first taste of Southern politics, because his advisor was V.O. Key, and so he made some references to the transformations in Southern politics that had occurred over his lifetime, actually.
Right.
And it blew my mind, actually, because like as many people, who don't know very much, you tell them, hey, did you know that the South used to be 100% or 98% Democratic? You're like, what?
Right.
And so I remember just feeling just kind of fascinated and intrigued by the story of Southern politics at that moment. And that was the moment I got hooked into Southern politics, Southern political history.
And is that what inspired you to when you applied to Cambridge, to sort of gravitate towards Anthony Badger?
Yeah, that's right. I graduated from college. I didn't really know what I was doing. I worked some, office job, but I was continuing to read, and so I read V.O. Key's Southern Politics of the Nation. Good stuff.
You're contractually obligated to reference that book in this interview.
Yes.
Box checked.
And so, but also other folks' work, and to deepen my interest. And then I kind of wanted to. I was interested in going and making a transition from history to political science. I had a sense that political science might be a better fit for my comparative advantages. I felt like I was reasonably good at math, so I was like, well, that might be more useful in political science. And
I assure you it would be.
Yeah. So then I used this kind of master's degree in England to try to, because it was a very open-ended, research-oriented degree.
Very British system.
Yeah, right. It was basically like, they're like, yeah, come on over, and you can live here, and you could work by yourself for a year on a thesis, and we'll advise you every once in a while. But it was a good year, and it was good for me at that time because it enabled me to sort of craft a thesis that was sort of halfway between, they sort of enabled me to pivot both towards American politics specifically, because my background was more in Latin America.
Right.
But also incorporate more political science.
So what was that thesis that you were putting together to make that pivot happen?
Yeah. Tony Badger and I, we shared an interest in, or maybe I glommed onto his interest in the role of of Southern moderates, and what did it mean to be a Southern moderate, quote unquote, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, especially as the sort of challenge of civil rights was coming down the pike. And so the thesis ended up being a study of 3 Southern senators, John Sparkman, Lister Hill, and John Stennis, all of whom were moderate in different ways.
Moderate for Alabama and Mississippi.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sparkman and Hill were liberal for Alabama and Alabama, but you're right. So Stennis's moderation was more of a stylistic one, but it still, still was pretty different in style from, a Bilbo or even an Eastland. And so there was a sort of a portrait of them, and different episodes, like one focusing on the Southern Manifesto and how that emerged, because Stennis was very involved in that.
Right. Yes, we're working at the Richard B. Russell Library. We
get a lot of Stennis.
We do get a lot. We get a lot of Stennis, and we have the mock office in the museum that has the table where the Southern Manifesto was drafted. Well, it's a replica of the table.
It's a replica.
It's a replica of the table of Senator Russell's. Yeah. His main suite in the Russell old Senate office building.
Okay.
But when he passed away, his office went to John Stennis. So, and then that table went to John Stennis, and then it went to Strom Thurmond, and then it went to Joe Biden. So
that's interesting.
There's a nice through line through American history.
Well,
or at least
long-serving senators. That's the one through line there.
Yeah, if you want that office suite, you've got to be around for at least 30 years or so.
Yeah.
So you spend this year in England, which is a very different system of graduate education than we have in America. Very, very hands-off, as you said. Tell me about your decision to apply to political science programs and who you thought you may want to study with, and then how you ended up at Berkeley with Eric Schickler.
Sure. I mean, from looking back, it all looks very planned and worked out great. But in all honesty, I was pretty clueless and didn't actually know that much about political science.
Okay.
Having not actually taken that many political science classes. I had another friend. So I told you about this one friend who had told me who had recommended I take David Mayhew's class. Well, another friend who had started a political science program already said, hey, well, you're interested in history, you're interested in political science, like maybe you should do, there's a subfield called American political development, right? So that's, people, well, just basically, political scientists who are interested in American history, And so he said, I actually went to ask a professor who I had never met, a professor at Yale, who I had never met while I was actually at Yale, but afterwards I went and asked Stephen Skowronek, who's like one of the leading figures in that field, hey, where should I, if I'm interested in this, like, where should I apply? He's like, well, you should apply to Yale, and then you should, a couple, and a few other places. So I applied to a few places, and I got into Yale and Berkeley. It was a tough choice between those two because they're both good programs. But actually, my ex-girlfriend was at Yale, and I was like, maybe I should go across the country. It'd be better for my mental health. So that's how I ended up at Berkeley. And to be honest, I ended up working. So my advisor at Berkeley was Eric Schickler, who was an incredibly amazing advisor and also just such a good fit for me and my interests. But I didn't even know he was there when I went there. So, kids watching at home, don't take your.
You took the words right.
Yeah,
that's usually my line. But we're all graduates. Former and late stage graduate students. And the folks who act like they have it all planned out from the very beginning, you don't trust those.
Yeah,
don't trust those folks.
Some people are very professionalized and they have they're very focused, and I had some friends like that at undergrad, but yeah, it's mostly people are just bumbling through, and then it works out for some of them.
Right. Well, tell me about how, after bumbling your way into Berkeley, you were able to, I don't want to say catch up because I don't know that you were necessarily behind, but how did you complete that transition from a historian into a political scientist or an emerging political scientist?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's nice about Berkeley is it's also kind of a unstructured place, and there's a lot of resources, and you're kind of left to your own devices. It's not. And no one's really, at least when I was there, no one was really telling you what to do. And there wasn't really a strong pressure to get out really quickly. So I actually felt like I had time to make that transition. And, everyone coming into political science, it's very common for people coming into political science to be coming from other fields.
Sure.
But wherever you're coming into, you're coming with your particular strengths, and then you're catching up in other areas, right? And I'm sure that's true in history as well. But so I had this existing kind of fairly narrow but pretty deep historical knowledge of a particular time period coming mostly out of my work at in Cambridge, focusing on the kind of early to mid 20th century South, and that I knew that was something I was still really interested in, and I wanted to continue exploring it. But actually, it took me several years to figure out, okay, how can I fit that into what political science wants, right? And actually, I migrated away from it. After my first year, I came up with a totally different dissertation topic that was focused on lobbying and revolving door in Congress and stuff like that, which is would have been a totally standard and fine one, but then I was like, this is boring. So I kind of went back to my first love of Southern politics, and just fortunately I was able to, partly maybe because I had stepped away, I was able to come back to it with fresh eyes and find ways to make that period, as an historical episode in a particular context, speak to larger issues that are of interest to political scientists. So for just people there's a long tradition of interest going back to VOK in the South as a sort of laboratory, in some sense, or an experiment in what if you do a bunch of not very good things to politics, but among them, what happens when you take away the basis for two-party competition.
Right.
what are the consequences of that, and what does that teach us about the role that parties play in democracy and so forth. So that was sort of the angle that I kind of came back into, kind of revisiting some of the themes that.
Sure, right, because V.O. Key, one of the four pillars of Southern politics, one party domination, and Key says that if you're going to have a truly small d democratic system, you have to have a two-party system. And then your research sort of takes that up from a particular angle of members of Congress and the Senate, right?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with him basically, in a broad strokes. And some people,
it's a safe place to be in political scientists.
And some people ask me who are not political scientists or whatever, just friends, like, if I want to read one book about Southern politics, should I read your book? I'm like, no, do not read my book. Read my book after you've read this book, and this book, and then mine is maybe a corrective to what have you.
You're even talking like a historian. You're giving folks the historiography of these things because it's fantastic.
It's the legacy of it.
Right.
So I think one of the things that sort of motivated my interest, or gave me. One of the things I think it's important when you're writing a dissertation is to have something that kind of bugs you or bothers you about the way other people have been talking about things. Annoyance is actually, or irritation is actually a surprisingly, powerful motivator. Especially if it's things that you think have a lot of insight but are getting something a little wrong. So part of what I read a couple of excellent work by two other, really good political scientists, Rob Mickey and Ira Katz-Nelson. They had these projects on Rob Mickey focusing on conceptualizing the South as a series of authoritarian enclaves.
Paths Out of Dixie.
Yeah, exactly, which is a wonderful book. And Ira Katz-Nelson, who has a long-term interest in understanding more at the level of Congress, what role did Southern members of Congress play particularly in shaping the New Deal and defining the limits of the New Deal and both of them are probably the two most influential works on my own thinking along with V.O. Key. But one thing that I thought that didn't fit with my sort of more in-depth textured look at Southern politics, and especially when I was looking at individual members' careers, was how much more that concerned they were often about being reelected, about pleasing their constituents, about worrying about being out of step with public opinion, the kinds of concerns that we associate with members of Congress generally, and that, when we're thinking about the American political system as a whole and Congress as a whole, are the kinds of motivations that lead members to be responsive to public opinion. Not completely responsive, but give them incentives to react to what the public is saying. Now, when I say the public here, this is a truncated definition of the public, right? This is really the white public, and a sort of class-biased selection of that, of course, as well, due to sort of economic means of disenfranchisement like poll taxes. But I felt like the sort of stylized portraits of the role that the motivations and incentives of Southern members of Congress in the one-party period were, had sort of severed what David Mayhew called the electoral connection, right? So the electoral connection is a very famous book, probably maybe the most famous book on Congress, which just really makes this point really clearly that a lot of what we see members of Congress do is because of their electoral incentives, right? And so I wanted to sort of restore, in some sense, the sense of the electoral connection to an understanding of what motivated Southern members in the one-party period.
Right. So this is, as you say, one-party period, because it's not until the 60s, really 64, 66, where you get a general election, a serious general election challenge to many, maybe not even most members of Congress. So that competition, that electoral competition, is all happening in the primary, the Democratic primary system. So you look at it from the period of white primary and post-white primary,
So
post all right, I guess.
Yeah. So So for me, Smith v. Allwright is not as big a break point because even though it's obviously a big legal and constitutional moment.
Yeah, but until 65.
Yeah, it doesn't really, because in almost very few places where there are enough black voters to really, really matter, except in small pivotal ways, in very close races,
Sure.
Until, as you said, until mass enfranchisement in the 1960s. There are moments, obviously, going forward. But yeah, so what I'm focused on, particularly since I was really interested in the role that Southern members played in the New Deal,
Right.
and in crafting the New Deal, but also in the way that the New Deal changed the nature of Southern politics and competition within the South and sharpened ideological cleavages within the party, right?
Right.
Gave this sort of like national focal point for what had hitherto been more of, intrastate factional cleavages or stylistic cleavages. Gave it a more of an ideological cast.
Right.
So anyway, my analysis really starts in around 1930 and goes till around 1960. So Smith v. Allwright is about halfway
sure.
between.
Yeah, so 44, 45, 44, I guess.
Yeah.
So, this period, as you've alluded to, is the sort of emergence of what James Patterson and others call, the conservative coalition.
Right, yeah.
And tell me about what you found as sort of those issues that where Democratic elected officials sort of started shifting away from their more liberal colleagues in the North and the Midwest and sort of gravitating towards more Republican positions or conservative positions, I would say, economically especially.
So one thing that's a little bit tricky about talking about that is that it's separating out, distinguishing between there being a certain set of distinctive issues where Southerners are conservative,
right,
or more conservative than they are on other issues. And then even economic issues, like obviously civil rights is definitely obviously one. Sure. But for example, labor unions, and more generally the structure of labor markets, were an early place where people started noticing that Southerners were no longer on the vanguard of like the New Deal, but also were now allying with Republicans.
Right.
So, to some degree, there are these distinctive issues where Southerners became more conservative earlier. But there's also this general trend. They also become more conservative across the board, like on just generic social welfare type issues where they had been very broadly supportive, or certainly no different than Northern Democrats. In the early 30s, they start shifting over just across the board. So to some degree, the way I would describe it is that issues related to the regulation of labor markets, but particularly focused on labor unions, because labor unions not only affected the sort of distinctive, not only threatened the low-wage labor market of the South, but also, especially the CIO, were an early force pushing for civil rights specifically. This is something Eric Schickler, in his more recent book, has talked really well about. So labor issues are sort of this leading indicator of Southern disaffection with national liberalism. I think that starts occurring in the mid-30s.
Right.
Even in the Wagner Act, even though Southerners vote for it, they're like pretty unenthusiastic about it. But then other issues catch up, basically, is what I would say.
Okay.
For the most part. And so even on issues unrelated to labor market specifically, like national health insurance or something like that, they're looking, by the time that really comes onto the agenda by the Fair Deal after World War II, that issue isn't really any different from labor issues, I would say. So there's sort of labor is like this leading indicator in the conservative in Southerners' shift from being this really liberal force in Congress to being this centrist.
Right. So it's almost that populist heritage is shed off during like you said, the Wagner Act, Taft-Hartley, Landrum-Griffin, and just all these laws. So, what you're talking about is stuff that is measurable through roll call votes and others. But how did you go about measuring their responsiveness to the public, or I should say the electorate, not the public?
Yeah. So there are a couple. Obviously that's a very tricky thing, just in general, to try to demonstrate, right? So the first thing, just to be clear, partly this is a matter of it's hard to define who's in the electorate or not, on a especially on a case, state by state or district by district basis, like usually so I actually took a sort of what I consider to be a relatively conservative view or definition of the public, which is to include, conservative being to include all whites as part of what I think of as the public to which members were responding.
Right.
Even though there were barriers to voting for many whites, especially low-income whites.
Right.
And empirically, turnout was obviously much higher among higher-income whites. I do think that there is a qualitative difference in those suffrage barriers to the ones that African Americans faced, right? So African Americans was like for in almost every place in the South, even after Smith v. Allwright, it was nearly impossible for African Americans in any large numbers to mobilize and vote. And even if they could surmount one barrier, another way would be found to disenfranchise.
Legal and extra legal.
Legal and extra legal, right? And I think that's somewhat different for poor whites who, for something like the poll tax, which has dissuaded many whites from voting. That's a barrier that could be overcome with sufficient mobilization and was occasionally overcome with sufficient mobilization and motivation, right? So I guess so just to start out, I think it's important to think about when you're thinking about members' incentives, like and how they're particularly how they're anticipating how the public will react. They have to anticipate not only the electorate as it currently exists, or as the voters who actually do turn out, but the electorate that could materialize in if they were sufficiently riled up, So there was very low turnout in many. Certainly, general election turnout was very low. In fact, primary turnout was almost often higher than general elections.
Oh, sure.
And because the general elections weren't competitive. But if they became competitive, then turnout went way up, right? So, but that elasticity of turnout was concentrated among the white population, which is my logic here. So just to be clear, like what I'm thinking about for the response. So then it's the question of like, how do you measure whether, or how do you evaluate whether members are being responsive to their constituents? And the primary way that I did was by trying to, first of all, focusing on members, summarizing in a sort of general sense how liberal or conservative they are on economic issues, right? Or for much of this period, that means how pro-New Deal versus anti-New Deal they are, right? And putting them on a continuum using like statistical methods for inferring from their roll call votes how liberal they are relative to their colleagues. And then sort of one of the biggest challenges, but also the contributions of the book, was to try to do the same thing for state publics, white publics in every state, based on survey data. So that's the thing that had been, I think, relatively neglected in this period. We just sort of we didn't have, sort of modern academic polling didn't really come on board until 1952.
Right.
And even then you don't have good estimates, like the sample sizes for states are very small. So it's actually very hard to come up with good estimates of state opinion. So people relied on proxies like, vote for, like Democratic vote share. But that, as you know, is not a great, it's not, in presidential elections, and certainly not in congressional elections, a good indicator of how liberal or conservative they are. So in modern, when we're thinking about this in contemporary settings, in contemporary American politics, we try to put together lots of surveys to estimate how liberal the public is in a given place, and then we correlate that with how liberal representatives are. So what I tried to do is take advantage of, there's actually a huge number of public opinion polls that were conducted by organizations like Gallup, beginning in 1936 and continuing into the 50s, their sampling strategies were not what you'd consider modern, but nevertheless it's still very extremely useful information, and the sample sizes are really big. So you can actually do a lot with them, and they ask a million different questions related to related to the New Deal and the Fair Deal and things like that. So hundreds of different questions. So basically, I was able to kind of use that information to see how liberal or pro-New Deal white publics were in every state, but in each year. So I could chart shifts in public opinion over time and across states, and see how that related to the shifts in how their representatives were voting on the same sorts of issues.
And is your argument that the responsiveness is because of electoral outcomes in Democratic primaries, or is it from letters to the congressman? What's the mechanism?
So I think
suppose?
I think there are probably three main mechanisms.
Okay.
So one, which is just always going to be true, was that a member of Congress from Alabama is a person from Alabama, and their neighbors are going to be, their views are going to be similar, and they're going to change over time in similar ways as they react to events in similar ways. So that's just true, generally speaking, and that doesn't rely on elections at all. That just means, you have a person who's from a particular place, they're going to, share some views at least with their neighbors and their constituents. But the mechanisms that I focus on, which are the electoral ones, are kind of go in two ways. One is through what you might call ex ante selection of certain types of representatives. So say liberal or conservative, right?
Okay.
So in many cases you had, certainly not universally, but in many cases you had a showdown between, here's a person who's taken a very strong pro-New Deal position, anti-New Deal position, and then the public, votes, right? And, that's how we often think about voting in a two-party system where, we're going to probably face a rematch between Biden and Trump. People know what they're choosing between pretty much there, and, they'll get the American public will get what it chooses, right? I mean, yes. And so that's sometimes called, as I said, selection as a mechanism of representation. So the way that might work, is if the public has gotten more conservative over time, well, then they will maybe be more likely to choose the conservative candidate versus liberal candidate. Now, obviously in a two-party system, they have labels attached to them called Republican and Democrat, which means that it's very easy to tell who's a liberal and who's a conservative. In a one-party system where they're all competing in a primary, it's harder, right? And that's one of the big critiques of one-party politics, is that it's actually the informational challenges for voters are great. That they, especially since voters, for the most part, don't have much information about politics, don't follow it, and it episodically pops up, and so generally political scientists are in favor of, believe that, democracy is not going to work well unless you make choices really easy for voters, right? So selection, I do think was a mechanism that operated at certain points in time in Southern primaries, but I think just as important, probably more important, was what's sometimes called anticipation, right? Where members of Congress are thinking about, are tracking public opinion through things like letters, like that's how they're getting their information about how public opinion is changing or how their constituents feel about a particular issue, and taking that information into account preemptively to head off, a challenge from a potential challenge. So in equilibrium, that member may never see a challenge, right? As we saw, even going into the 90s, a lot of these places that are still colored blue on this map, I don't know if you can see, but in the South, as soon as they retired, they flipped to red, right? And that's because those people were receiving weak challenges anyway, because they were for a variety of reasons. They had incumbency advantage, but also we're pretty in step with their constituents, right?
Right.
And we're working hard to avoid being out of step. So I think that's really important too, especially when you think about the ideological evolution of people who continued over time, right? These long-serving people who really shifted their, in the South mainly, shifted from more left-wing or liberal views, pro-New Deal views, to more anti-New Deal, conservative views, without having to be replaced, right? They tracked their constituents. The Southern white public, I should say, is also making the same transformation over the time period. That's the nice thing about the poll data. You can see, Southern whites are like super pro-New Deal in 1936, 37, and then they shift very sharply to the right, just, right as their representatives are doing the same thing, right?
Right.
So, or leading them in some cases.
So, with your study, ending at roughly 1960 or so.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're talking about a very different electorate post 64, 65
Yes.
in the South. How, if you extended your analysis to more towards the present through the civil rights era and post civil rights era, how would your analysis fit in with that new electorate?
So, one of the reasons I stopped in 1960 is because it would become much more complicated, right?
Sure.
Because not only is the electorate changing, but of course you also have, before the electorate changes, you basically have this artificial condition that forced all political competition within a single organization, which is the Democratic Party, right? And ambitious politicians, if they wanted to get into office, they had to, the route to power was through the Democratic Party. If they were liberals, if they were conservatives, it was all through the Democratic Party. And to some degree, that actually remained true for another generation.
Right, oh yeah.
As I'm sure you know, and people who study this know, it's not like, so there's this famous, maybe perhaps made up quote from Lyndon Johnson when he's signing I think it's the Civil Rights Act, 1964, where supposedly he said, I'm signing away the South for a generation or something like that, or something like that. And that's pretty misleading in a lot of ways, right? Because first of all, there had already been, 20 years of inroads at the presidential level, and then that gradually, starts trickling down. But first of all, it's not really complete at the presidential level until 2000.
Right.
You still have Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton; they're winning southern states, and but then, let alone at something like the House members, Senate members, state legislatures, and even now local governments and
sheriffs,
sheriffs
coroners,
and county clerks. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, it didn't all happen at once, right, obviously. But the fact that it is happening means that you can't just focus on. It would be a much more complicated analysis, and the dynamics do change because now ambitious politicians, the Trent Lotts of the world or whatever, they're coming up. They have a choice about whether they're going to be Democrats or Republicans, and if they don't view the Democratic primary as a viable route to political office, in part because it now has a lot of black voters and has become a lot more liberal, then they have this other option, which is to switch over to the Republican Party, and then they do that.
Right. Well, tell me about the process of going from the dissertation to the book.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll learn something. Maybe Alec here will learn something. What was that process like for you, and how did maybe your study or your conclusions change in between those the intervening time?
Yeah, that's interesting. In some ways there's more in the dissertation, and in some ways there's less.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of extraneous stuff. There's a lot of footnotes that take up a whole page. Or rabbit holes that I ran down on. So some of that you take out. I need a clearer, more concise point to this book, right? And someone actually has to read this book. Not that many people have read it, but more people than have read my dissertation. So there needs, it needs to, be more focused, and it needs to be better written, all that stuff, right? But then, actually, the part that I was mentioning about measuring public opinion through this trying to come up with ideological summaries of public opinion, that actually wasn't in the dissertation in that form, because that took a lot of I had to develop a statistical model to do that. Like actually, that was a lot of work and a big, to the extent that I've made intellectual contributions to political science, it's one of the major ones. And so that was done after I moved into this office.
Okay.
So, and that was actually pretty important, I think, because before that I was able to look at things on more like an issue by issue basis, But then of course you're a prisoner of like, okay, has this question been asked like multiple times over time? That means, there are some questions like, are you in favor of labor unions? That was asked like, 14 times in 14 different polls over a 15-year period, right? That's actually a lot, and each of those polls is like 3,000 people. That's actually a lot of people for polls. So I was able to do some analyses based on that one issue, but still that is not nearly the degree of granularity that you would really want. Mm-hmm. And whereas, if you can use like all 200 different polls that included at least one question about the New Deal, then that's something like, 300,000 or more, 500,000 respondents. That's gives you much better sense of, state differences and also how they changed over time.
You also, I think, teach a class on Southern politics.
I have.
You
yes.
have.
I haven't taught it for a few years now.
Well, you'll have to fix it. But when you do, what is it that you try to, I assume, I could be wrong, the majority of these students are non-Southerners.
True.
What are the takeaways that you hope they learn from this class on Southern politics, and why do you justify here at MIT an entire class on Southern politics? Like what is it about Southern politics that's worth an entire semester of a student's academic career?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Well, so to some degree, some of them are Southerners, and some of them are like, I want to understand my region.
Sure.
I want to understand why it is. Often they're dissatisfied with the way it is, so they want to say. So I think there are several things that I want the students to, and this is an undergrad class, by the way. So,
right.
So one is that the South is fascinatingly, Southern politics is fascinating in a lot of different dimensions, right? It has obviously many tragic aspects to it. Mm-hmm. And it's important to acknowledge those and be really aware of those, not just because it's important to know that the United States hasn't just been some perfect democracy from the beginning, but also to know that there have been moments of progression and retrogression, right? That's, I think, one of the big things, right? That progress towards a more democratic, inclusive polity is not monotonic. It doesn't go in all just one direction. So you have things like Reconstruction, and then you have the reaction to Reconstruction, which undoes basically almost all, except for slavery itself, of the progress during Reconstruction, and then you have the second Reconstruction, and so forth. And there are minor variations within that too. Even before the Civil War, there's sort of ebbs and flows of commitment to democracy in the South and in the nation. So knowing that, and this has actually particularly even become more salient in recent years with the rise of Trump and with the threat of democratic backsliding that he poses, I think the idea that you can't take for granted that America is just inherently democratic, or like it just is by definition a democracy. I think that's something that I want people to understand. Another, though, is a nuanced portrait of the role that the South, especially the representatives of the white South, has played in American political development, which is complicated, and from the present perspective, or from a more progressive or left perspective, is which most of my students are coming from, is nuanced, and that Southerners simultaneously while they were defending Jim Crow and Southern members of Congress, while they were defending Jim Crow and its system of racial oppression, were also constructing the New Deal, right? And not just like going along for the ride, but like driving important aspects of the New Deal and trying to understand that apparent paradox, which is not just unique to the New Deal. You can look back in time and forward in time, that the complex role that the South has played in national politics is I want to sort of get them away from a flattened perspective on the South that is just bad or just one thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about the role that the South has played, and you can look at Earl and Merle Black, the Vital South, and others before and after. The talk about the central role of the South in, if it were the blacks, it's the presidential elections, and others, it's legislation. Does the South, as a geographic region, still play that role in American politics, or have we shifted away from geography to ideology, or maybe not even ideology, just personality?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, okay, the South is no longer like a swing region or anything. Like it's not like it's not like the region that's like the king-making region or whatever.
Right.
It's the bastion of Republican,
right.
And of conservatism, right? It's like the anchor of conservatism in the United States, with the asterisk that how you define the South probably has to change. Like Virginia, obviously, it still got Washington and Lee University. It's still got Lee Highway, I think. Whatever. It's still got elements of, and certainly, big swaths of it are still very Southern. But, as a state, it's more like it's like Pennsylvania or whatever. It's like a northern state because of the growth of Washington D.C. And there's some, right. But for the most part, the South is still a very coherent region, I would say. Still very socially conservative, especially, but also has merged with the Sun Belt in general as a sort of model of non-union, low regulation political economy that makes it distinctive from much of the country, but also gives it connections to places like Idaho or whatever. So I do think it has lost some coherence. It was such a coherent region for so long. It's no longer nearly as coherent, but still quite distinctive. Okay, but the other, of course, in the intervening 10 years, now you have more. It's not just Virginia. It's like Georgia and other places, North Carolina, that are now these more complex mixes of, the very traditionally Southern, you might say, part with these dynamic cities that are, and you get this extreme urban-rural conflict that is now national. It's also
right.
very national, but it's really acute in the South. So that makes the sort of within state cleavages in many states as acute as the South versus the rest of the nation. And then of course there are still the racial divides, right? Which are in a place like Mississippi. That's what really matters. It's not the urban-rural per se.
Right.
Yeah.
It's Delta, if there is a geographical region we're pointing to. With the realignment of the South in the 90s, 2000s, and you had Republicans finally taking over Southern state legislatures, which for some came even in later 2010, 2014 in some places. That led to redrawing of legislative maps.
Yeah.
And Georgia, for example, you only really have maybe one competitive electoral district.
Yeah.
The Georgia 2nd with Sanford Bishop in Southwest Georgia, which is a majority black district.
Yeah.
if that's the case, that you have super safe districts, safe to super safe districts, would we not expect to see the dynamics that you talk about, where you have your responsiveness, it's still there, and now it's just shifted to the Democratic? There's going to be Republican opponents and Democratic opponents, but they're going to get 40% of the vote, regardless of whatever they do in those districts.
Yeah. That's a really good question. So I think you see it popping up a little bit. So, I'm blanking on his name. A very senior senator from Mississippi who had that very tight re-election. We had gone to a runoff.
Thad Cochran?
Yeah.
Well, he ran against, it was that state senator who
yeah.
Well, it was Cochran, and then he won and then retired.
Yeah.
And that's how we got Cindy Hyde-Smith. Yeah. And then the other one would be Roger Wicker. Is the current. So it had to have been Thad Cochran.
Yeah, it must be Thad Cochran. Well, anyway, in that race, which was only, what was that, like 8 years ago or something?
Yeah, something like that.
He had this it was like a Tea Party challenge to a person who was more of a transactional, bring home the pork conservative, which is a big cleavage within the Republican Party right now. Who's gonna, are you gonna kind of play the game of conventional politics where, you're advocating for conservative policy positions, but you're also trying to get goodies for your home state and home district, and at the end of the day, your goal is to come to some sort of, conclusion. Anyway, that versus like a Tea Party, burn it all down kind of conservatism is a pretty important difference. It played out in that Republican primary, and the other thing that's fascinating is in the runoff, the difference appears to have been made by the mobilization of black voters, right? Who voted for Cochran, right? So, and kept him in office. So I think, that's a case where, that's, I think, where you are starting to see it, because it's not like the Democrat, not like Cochran was going to lose to a Democrat. Or for that matter, his challenger wasn't going to lose to a Democrat either. It was like, yeah.
Right.
And I think you're seeing some stylistic differences like that appear. However, and here I'm really just speculating, but it's not as prevalent as it was before, and in part because I think it's about like the organization of political ambition, as I said, where if you had two talented politicians in the same district, they had to both run in the Democratic Party. But now you have this. Now they can exit over into the other party. Right now there can be two parties, so that's one thing. But the other, I guess, that's probably not as important as just the way in which sort of national party competition can sort of crowd out everything else.
Right.
And to the extent that there are, like, within, primary, competition, it's like organized around, like, Trump versus not, which is not even really an ideology per se. It's more of a style and, like, personal loyalty to him. Still pretty important, but yeah. But it's a good question why it is that there's not more intra-party conflict in partisan primaries today in the way that it used to be then. I guess another reason is the Democratic Party in that time had to, if it wanted to head off third-party challenges, like not really to a Republican, but like, populist of various challenges, it had to create this space within the party for competition to take place so that it could be settled before the general election. Okay, and because of the white primary in particular, then you could settle basically differences within the white population and then go to the general election unified. That was an important feature, a pillar of the of Jim Crow system. And if you didn't have that, if the party didn't allow for sufficient competition, then strong insurgent forces would create other third parties or run as independents in ways that might lead to the mobilization of black voters or otherwise, threaten the racial system of the South. That's that imperative to the Democratic and Republican parties do not have as strong an incentive to foster competition within the party or to allow for it. Now, there's strong incentives actually to try to squash that, and not always successful, but I think the organization has. So I think that might be more important. Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point you have about the parties and the role that the party, whether it be a strong party or a weak party, like what is the role of the party in influencing this?
Yeah.
Because
you're talking organization,
right? Because you're talking about mass opinion of the electorate.
Yeah.
What role does the party organization, party leadership in Congress have in shaping? Is this a listen to the public or listen to your leadership, or is this where these two are actually in conversation with one another of like, you can have this vote but not this vote, sort of thing?
Well, I'm going to answer that first with respect to the one-party period.
Sure.
And then I'll maybe answer
Yeah.
But so
Please.
Thinking about the one-party period, I think, Key's view, which I think is roughly right, was that the Democratic Party as an organization in the South was very thin, was like a shell, right? And it wasn't always true. I mean, certainly the state executive committees could have important influence over things like, slates of presidential electors, and especially the Dixiecrat versus loyalist conflicts in the late 40s and early 50s and stuff took place, within the party organization. And so they did exist, but they were, partly for the reasons I was explaining before, they were more hands-off. The organization itself was relatively weak, and and so that being said, one of the things you see over and over is this a bit of a tension between once people get in Congress, between the organizational imperatives in Congress and the pressures to be a good team player, to support the party leadership and so forth, which often meant, being pressured to vote for liberal legislation that their constituents were not so enthusiastic about. So and weighing upward ambition versus wanting to stay in good with your constituents. So Lister Hill was a very ambitious politician and was probably on the trajectory to national leadership of some sort, like majority leader or vice presidential candidate, many Southerners ended up being in that period. But then he made a conscious choice to basically step away from national leadership because he felt like he needed to protect his flank at home. So that tension, I think, played out. So that's how I think, to the extent that the Democratic Party as an organization influenced that period, it was often through those sort of intra-Congress pressures. Now, I think it's a little more complicated because, first of all, there continue to be those pressures on, say, Republican members to go along with but then there are also all these contrary pressures that are from, Fox News or specific people within Fox News, like John Hannity or whatever, and then Trump, obviously, as an important feature, and Tea Party organizations, a little bit, going back a little bit in time, or all those things are pulling. They're not. When you say what is the party, it isn't exactly just literally the state executive committee or something like that. Obviously, there are all these para organizations that are sort of part of the para party. Fox News is arguably part of the Republican Party.
The penumbras and emanations.
Yeah, penumbras and emanations, right? But they're part of the party too, and they're pulling in these different directions. So I do think there are. You were going back to asking about sort of how to. I took your question to be to some degree about how do organizations play a role here? It's not just unmediated relationship between public opinion,
right?
And I think that's right. I mean, the other thing that just happens everywhere is locally there are local, groups that want things from the government. Some of those are ideologically motivated, like, Tea Party or something like that. And some of them are like, I don't know, like independent car dealers or whatever, or small business owners. They come together and they're like, we want to nominate one of our own to be in, they organize within. So I think there's some of that as well. So anyway, yeah. So I don't know if that's a very coherent answer.
No. Well, I mean, it's as coherent as trying to understand what the party organization is anymore.
Yeah.
And especially in an era so dominated by personality, which if you're thinking about how Donald Trump can control the party through personality,
and through public appeals, like unmediated public appeals.
It's really not unlike sort of the deep South of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, where you had your Theodore Bilbos, and your Gene Talmadges, and even later, I think, with George Wallace, where through force of personality and also, like you said, how much of a paper tiger the Democratic Party institution actually was, it was controlled by the chief executive in the state. Gene Talmadge, he appoints his people. The Democratic governor is the leader of the party, and you can, once we get up to the 90s and 2000s, when Democratic governors start losing, you see how quickly the party organization just collapses. Because there's nothing really there.
There. Top down, and that's a story of party organizations generally. Like they become much more dominated by, like the precinct organizations that used to undergird, especially the Democratic Party in the North, which they're gone. I lived in Philadelphia. I was actually born in Philadelphia, and I've actually lived there a couple times.
Okay.
But I lived there for a year, a few years ago, and we lived in South Philly, and it was just around when I moved there. It was just around the block, or was this the 14th precinct Democratic office. It's like this is the local party's office in Philadelphia, which is a very traditional, old-time Democratic machine city to this day. Even so, that office was raised and replaced with condos, luxury condos, in the time that I was living there.
Right.
And so that kind of like local level federated sort of system of the parties has become replaced by nationally oriented fundraising apparatuses, and then there are probably competing power centers there, right? Like there's the Mitch McConnell fundraising, center, and that is not in line with the Trump one, right? Or other,
or Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Right. And there are individual people who have they have their appeals, and Americans for Prosperity, things like that.
Sure,
the Koch network is another network.
Right. I sort of made a joke when I first got here, looking at the maps and talking about how that was what country is this?
Yeah.
It doesn't look anything. Going back to the one party South, the system that we have in place of super PACs and PAC spending and online appeals based on perhaps outrageous things you say on social media. I mean, those things. I guess maybe they did have those in some degree, the independent newspapers that everybody used to run in the South and some things like that.
Well, I mean, that's a big change, right? I mean, just the nationalization of American politics, right? And the degree to which these sort of symbolic big picture battle, national battles have come to a large degree, they're not completely, overwhelmed sort of local level concerns. Like the Cochrane race is an example. He was like, look, this I built this this dock in Pascagoula or whatever, whatever, in pointing these things, and then they're like, but wait a minute, what have you done to at that time I can't remember what it was about, what have you done to symbolically try to repeal Obamacare or something like that. You haven't shut down the government to repeal Obamacare, it's or something.
Right.
So I think that sort of nationalization and the demise of all those little newspapers, all those of us who are historians, I don't know about you, but who've done historical work, those are gold mines for what's actually happening, in our little profiles of the, it's how we learn about it, but it's also how people learned about who their congressman was, right? And I guess that's another thing about the sort of why there's not why intra-party competition isn't stronger.
Yeah.
To have real intra-party competition, like you need voters to be able to discern differences between and then be mobilized and care about them and everything like that. But at the very least, they need to be saying like, well, this person would do this and this person would do that, and like. And that requires like knowing about them as people over and above their party affiliation, right?
Right.
But how do you know that if all political news is just about Trump versus Biden, right? And there's no local newspaper even telling you, that maybe tell you who your representative is, but certainly doesn't tell you who their challenger is. Like,
well, and even if a lot of news, if there is local news, it's online.
Yeah.
But for folks who don't go directly to the sources, often they get it from aggregators on social media, and there you are beholden to the algorithm that is going to steer you towards.
And the algorithm, privileges, generally speaking, like outrage and extremism and like getting you riled up.
Right. It's probably not a substantive discussion on the local sales tax.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, those old newspapers, it's not like they were amazing either. Like, it's not like they were incredible journalism. I mean, they were whatever. And they also were very biased, and they probably, whatever. They favored the incumbent a lot, usually. And,
no doubt.
There's a reason why the incumbency advantage was really strong in, like, the 60s and 70s. And like, why these people were able to hold on is, like, they had a lot of advantages at their disposal.
Right.
That have now fallen away, too.
Yeah. As we start wrapping up, with Viochi, and it's not really in vogue anymore, but realignment theory and how you have these critical moments like the populist revolt, the New Deal, the second Reconstruction of civil rights movement.
Yeah.
When we look back with the benefit of time and data, are we going to see our current political moment in that same sort of vein where the Trump era is a realigning event or somehow reshapes our political system, if not in realignment, in some other form or fashion?
So I think one of the reasons that realignment has fallen out of fashion, even though I think it is still a useful concept, but I think it's too totalizing. It makes it sound like not makes it sound like it actually, in its, Walter Dean Burnham form, argues that like there are these certain very concentrated moments when like all the action happens and everyone gets all riled up and are thinking in ideological terms and there's a sudden and durable shift in the party coalitions and their policy commitments, and then boom, new party alignments, sometimes new majority party, new policy commitments, and then there's stasis, right? And it's like all of the political system changes all at the same time. And one of the sort of themes of American political development, like the subfield, is that different aspects of the polity have different institutional trajectories and different logics, different temporal logics that are changing at different times, right? So it's not all of a piece where it's all changing, That all being said, I do think so when you're thinking about, Trump. The electoral realignment of Trump, like where like low education whites shifted so massively towards the Republican Party, which is like one of the biggest probably electoral shifts, and vice versa, high education whites shifting towards the Democrats. That had already started happening under Obama, right? So I mean, really, I think, So in some sense, Trump is taking advantage of shifts like that, rather than any locking him in and everything like that. That being said, I do think that Trump represents a real shift in many aspects of how American politics works. Not even so much in the electoral coalitions or even in their policy commitments per se, but in just like the basic norms regarding electoral procedures and what is acceptable for politicians to say and do, and how to use political power, the control of the government to punish your enemies, and all sorts of things like that. Those have all shifted very, very drastically, and also there are associated changes in like the structure of the Republican Party in particular, and so I think the Trump era is gonna. I certainly think of it as a break point in American politics, and that has caused me to think, okay, I need to fundamentally reshape how I teach American politics.
Well, unpack that for me, because that's what I usually I ask this question in a way of election analysis and campaign election analysis, and it's like, has this got harder? And that's usually just an opportunity to let people go, oh my God, it's awful.
Yeah.
But no, tell me more about how this current political moment is informing the way that you think as a researcher, you think as a teacher of political science.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what this political moment has reinforced is just that there's a fundamental thing about democracy, which is democracy, fundamentally speaking, is really about two things. It's about everyone being able to participate in, and that's where the one part of South really fell short, was like obviously excluding in very important large portions of the electorate. So, and to be clear, by that point alone, I think that the South does not deserve to be called a democracy until post 1970, say. So that's one big component. But the other basic thing is, like, you have competition you have electoral competition where if the loser loses, they accept loss. That's like, there's a very pithy quote by Adam Zavorsky, who is a eminent political scientist and theorist, who says, like, democracy is a system where parties lose elections. That's really important. Like, that's his pithy thing about democracy. The losing is really important, right? And we just take it for granted. We did take it for granted that, Mitt Romney lost a tough, race, or Al Gore, barely lost, and the Supreme Court said, we're gonna stop counting the votes here, and we're done, certify this election. And he's like, okay, I guess I'm not president, and then I'm gonna go right off into the sunset, That happened, to Nixon in 1960. He lost, and maybe, it's arguably the fraud in Chicago, could have.
People are saying.
Yeah, people are saying. Like, a lot of people are talking about it. And he just accepted it, right? And it's not that. And this is Nixon, right? So it's not that elections are perfect. And it's not that they're fraud-free, and it's not that there's some sort of, like, voice of the people spoken. It's just that we have agreed as a system to say, this is how we decide who's in charge. And we check this person we chose because they, went through this election and went through this process. And, like, even if it wasn't perfectly fair, or, like, even if the person who won the majority of the votes didn't win the electoral college, we say, well, this is the system. We're going to accept that, right?
Right.
And that's how we... that's how democracy, that's what the key function of democracy is, arguably, not choosing the best person or the most representative person to lead you, but just choosing one person based on something other than violence, And so that's what Trump is really calling into question,
I think the point you make about, elections not being perfect is it's something that I think we in this room take for granted. Because we study these, we understand how they work at sort of a very granular, nerdy level.
Yeah.
But for most people, they say, "Oh, look, there were these fraudulent. This person voted over here." And I was an election judge twice in Missouri when I was in college, 2004 and 2006, and this was back with the old punch card.
Yeah.
Well, one was punch card, and one was optical scan. But each time at our polling place, when you get together and you count the ballots, we were short one ballot each time. And we counted those things 4 or 5 times. A ballot disappeared. And that was just...
Probably an illegal immigrant took it.
That was most likely somebody's perspective. But, it's like somebody walked out with a ballot or somebody signed in and it's like, I don't want to wait in line or something like that.
Something happened, yeah.
But, if...
Yeah.
Kickoff outside, I guess.
It's like it's construction.
Right. Yeah. This place is bustling.
Yeah.
But well, tell me about your current projects that you're working on.
Can I just respond to what you just said, though?
Absolutely.
Which is, this is the part of the irony, right? Even though you and I and those of us who study elections like closely, though, these aren't like as pristine as we think. An important part of making the whole system go is everyone acknowledging the legitimacy of the election,
right.
of the election, right? And so there is a way, and there's this very delicate balance between wanting to ensure that that proper election procedures are followed and it's a clean election and everything like that, without going so far in that direction as to undermine faith in the system, right? Because it is sort of built a little bit on a myth that like whoever won this is legitimately the winner, right? And that or maybe not a myth, but it's something we've all agreed by convention.
Well, it's a good faith.
Yeah.
It's a system that institutions are only as good as the participants.
Yeah.
There's nobody's actually going to make you do some things as we've found in the past few years.
Right.
But it requires good faith partners on
also,
winning and losing sides.
Right, and also if one side starts losing faith in the other side, then they have incentives to start also doing the same thing that they think the other side is doing. So, and I'm sure that's what a lot of people who are concerned about voter fraud are thinking, like, well, they're stealing these elections, the Democrats, and so we need to steal, that's the kind of logic that leads to the unraveling of the equilibrium that is democracy, right? Anyway, you were going to ask about my current.
Yeah. Let's maybe something more hopeful.
I don't know.
You have a recent book that was, I guess, more or less recent book out. Tell me about that and tell me about your current projects.
Sure.
Southern and non-Southern.
Yeah,
related.
so after writing that, after my dissertation, I sort of started working partly with my former colleague, who used to be right there, Chris Warshaw. We started working on a series of data and methodological and substantive projects related to state politics nationally. But across the whole country, but also trying to look at them over how they've evolved over time and the interplay between shifts in public opinion and shifts in policymaking, and so that culminated in the book I think you were referencing called Dynamic Democracy, which it talks about a lot of things, but one of the sort of key things it focuses on is how does state policymaking respond, and over what time frame does it respond to shifts in the general, big general ideological shifts in public opinion in that state, and the big takeaway is that it does respond, but it does so sluggishly and incrementally over time, right? And that it takes a lot of time for something that starts like an impulse or a shift that occurs at the mass level to get to sort of filter out through the political system into actual policy changes, right?
Right.
Even very popular ones. There's just so many places in the process where it can be stopped. Anyway, so that's one of the things. So in some sense, that is a hopeful, largely actually that book is a pretty hopeful perspective on American democracy, because it does argue that there's that the political system sort of in a general sense responds to what the people are pushing for.
Right.
Right. But it also helps to explain why people are so frustrated, because it doesn't happen immediately, right? Which may not be bad, certainly some people would say, like the founders of the authors of the Federalist Papers might say, well, okay, that's like part of the design of the system here is to slow things down and make sure that public opinion is really serious about what it has just come to. So I completed that project, and I have some, follow-on projects that are related. So I have a paper, for example, that I've just been working on that's about, it's more about how to think about the multidimensionality of public opinion. So going back, for example, to going way back to the 1940s, or especially the 30s, like white Southerners, were very liberal on some issues and very conservative on other issues, right? And so what that means is that you can't just use the word liberal or conservative you have to say they're liberal on this and they're conservative on this. And what you're saying there is that there are multiple dimensions, latent, unseen dimensions to their political preferences. And so I'm interested in sort of using what we call ideological scaling methods, but multidimensional scaling methods to uncover that multidimensional. So I have that, and I'm also working on a paper on climate change opinion in Africa, which is very outside my wheelhouse, but I'm working with some people here. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we could probably do this for hours and hours and hours, but you probably have things to do this afternoon.
I want to say one more thing, because it is about Southern politics.
You do it.
Which is, I have a paper on the TVA.
There you go.
So I have to actually finish that paper, but it's about like the political effects of the TVA.
I mean, the Tennessee Valley Authority, man. I can still remember my grandmother's pastor.
Yeah.
His family were Republicans going back to the TVA because Roosevelt took their land.
So yeah, interesting.
That was and I don't think his ardor ever cooled about that. And it was like, but Reverend, like you weren't even around. But like electricity is a good thing, right? But it does impact some people, right?
Oh, it was very disruptive for some people. Yeah. On the whole, though, people loved it.
Right.
The people whose land weren't taken were like, oh wait, I get like these enormously. First of all, I get electricity, and I get cheap electricity. Not to mention all
and
roads
recreational,
and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, for most people it was very popular, but yeah, especially initially it was very disruptive.
Fortunately, rural broadband, which is often considered the new TVA, hopefully, fingers crossed, it's a little less disruptive to people's lives. But no, I'll be very interested to see that.
Sorry, I know we need to wrap it up. So
no. Yeah, like I said, I've got the time. You're the one on a schedule. But Devin, thank you so much on behalf of the University of Georgia, Richard B. Russell Library.
Sure.
I'm Ashton Ellett, Alex Stevens here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.